Okay. Should we remove that online? I can do that. I can do that. Sure. Okay, sure. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. This is the fourth year of the AI Society experiment. We are experimenting with intermingling disciplines that hardly speak to each other so often and so freely. So thank you so much for being with us. I have Professor Samir Suez alongside me, who has been masterminding this edition of the program. And as you know, we blend law, physics, and maths together to explore the trickiest parts of technology and law. Today, we have a very special event. We have one Italian from afar and one Canadian from here, just to mess things up. Connecting from beautiful Williamsburg, Virginia, United States, Iria Giuffrida, who teaches and researches at the wonderful University of William and Mary. That's a wonderful university, wonderful law school. Alongside myself, Professor Nicolas Vermeys, who was actually Canadian and works and teaches in University of Montreal or Montreal, depending on what pronunciation you prefer, and William and Mary as well. So both are very, very accomplished scholars and professors in law and technology in different fields, and they will tell you more, but both are engaging the hardest matters. And for what is worth, and I'll cut to the chase if you don't mind, guys, so we save time for questions. Here we wanted to tackle two critical aspects of technology and law: the embeddedness of technologies in our physical world and in the legal world. So Professor Giuffrida will kick off and speak about smart city and how cities are becoming smart. Afterwards, Professor Vermeys will lead us through the innovation of Courthouse. So how trials have become more familiar, or trying to familiarize with technologies. So Iria, I'd say the floor is yours, and we are so glad to have you here, although we can't share food. So please, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much. And let me start with the typical Zoom sentence. I'm going to share my screen. I am sorry for the audience because I cannot see you, but probably it's better for my nerves. I'm told that there's 500 plus of you. I know that is a joke. But I wanted to start by thanking Professor Pin and Professor Suez for inviting me to participate in this event. I think Professor Pin knows that I have, alongside obviously Professor Vermeys, quite an interest in looking at the interface and the connection between law and technology, the kind of issues that arise and how do we think about them. So what Professor Vermeys and I thought was to try to give you a micro analysis, of course, of only some of the issues. We couldn't cover in 20 minutes the whole breadth of them. And we're trying, it's not always very easy, but we're trying to mirror the patterns of our presentation. I'll be talking to you, as Professor Pin said, about smart cities. And I'm going to try to think a little bit how smart cities are designed. I'll give you my interpretation of what the features of smart cities are, and I really want to emphasize that this is my interpretation, and it's not necessarily one you need to ascribe to. I'd be very, very keen to hear your critiques. And then I'll be looking at a critical function, sort of that space that as a lawyer interests me, and where I think that technology and governance, which is sort of governing la res publica, is bringing some concerns that I really would like what certainly students and politicians do to think about. And I just put on the slides what Professor Vermeys will be talking about, but I'm going to leave it to him, of course, to then chart his own presentation. So I think that many of you have heard the terminology of smart cities. What I would like to do is chart a very brief history of what smart cities are, and then with you work around the components and where the problems arise. And as a good old Italian, I couldn't start a presentation without going back to the Greek polis. And the reason why I do it is not to show off, although this is what I think my American audience would often thinks about, but it's because the concept of the smart city is actually not a new concept. The idea of having an urban space that is planned and is capable of improving the physical and political life of its citizens is something that we inherit from Greek philosophers, and even before them in Asia Minor, there were sort of philosophers and commentators that thought about the city as being really the space, not just the physical space, but a little bit the idealistic space of where the kind of reality where we want to live into, which has this mixture of ideal space. I'm going to use a key word that we're hearing a lot, especially you guys in Europe, key sustainability, and on the other side, key functionality. Very, very briefly sort of charting how the literature tells us that smart cities have come to develop. We start with the label of Smart City 1.0. And the idea of the Smart City 1.0 is a smart city built from the bottom up. And so imagine, so the very first image that you have there is the idea of, it was a town in Portugal that was going to be built completely from afresh, and so embedding technology, sustainable technology that could develop with the growth of the city. It never got built. Generation Smart City 2.0, which is what you see in the second picture. And if you look at it, I think like me, you cannot necessarily see any particular technology standing out. The technology is embedded. This is a small town in Brazil. As you can see, sort of built on the facade of a mountain, and IBM collaborated with the local government to sort of position particular sensors that would be capable of anticipating a landslide in the event of torrential rain. And it started with sort of this detection ideal, and then it expanded in collecting a whole host of data that have got nothing to do with landslide, but they become incredibly valuable for IBM. And the sort of the third generation of smart cities is where we are now, and essentially you and I are becoming the infrastructure of the smart city. We're playing different roles. We're playing the roles, of course, of the citizen. We're playing the role of the data creator, because it's our data points that are being analyzed and processed by technology. But we're also the recipients of decisions that are based on that kind of data. And again, looking at the literature, there's sort of two major themes where the concept of smart city, or two major sort of areas where the concept of smart cities is often seen: smart transport and smart energy. And as I said, the latter in this moment is obviously a great concern for Europeans. It is, but a little bit less for American audiences, just because we obviously rely less on, if at all, on Russian energy. And as an aside, I think very few people will ever thank Putin for anything, but it's certainly the recent 8 months have certainly shifted government's attention towards investment in green technology. So if there ever is a silver line to catastrophic macro political events, then we should actually acknowledge it. So thinking about what makes a city smart, and again, if you look at the terminology in the literature, there's all sorts of different approaches that commentators have. Some definitions are aspirational, as I said, the kind of the tech polis, right? So this perfect space and environment where everybody lives in harmonious balance, where we respect the environment and we maximize our resources. There's another group of commentators that think think of smart city as the city that has, sort of, if you wish, the highest amount of technology used for management of the city. And then there's a third group, which is actually growing, which considers a city a smart space in the context in which it is capable of including those populations that historically are marginalized in the context of the city. And so here you have a picture of a feature of sort of something that is smart in American cities. Bicycles are quite rare, and as Professor Pin will tell you, there's no public transport where I am, but never mind. So this is capital bike shares. So there's versions all across, certainly all across Europe. I know I've seen several in London. They were called the body bikes, and certainly also in Brussels. And again, these are just regular bikes, but of course they are kitted out with particular sensors that allow the city transport management to locate bikes once they've been used by the public, but also make bikes available in those critical junctures where commuters are going to need them and are going to use them. But a little bit like all forms of technology, they started out as being quite a new form of technology that made cities smart, and I'm trying to date it back. It's probably, I want to say 2008, when sort of the smart bike movement kicked off. But in this moment, it's now old technology. And so at one point in time, trains were modern technology, and they no longer are modern technology. So what if we sort of now try to think about sort of the components, what makes a city smart, and do you really need a city to sort of be labeled as a smart city? And as I told you, I've sort of come up with my own definition, because if you look at the literature, this is how smart cities are portrayed, right? You just see all the different junctions in which, for the most part, IoT, but obviously also other forms of connectivity are located in the city. To me, the smartness is not the location of IT devices, it's sort of what happens behind them, right? What happens with the data that is collected, that is processed, and then that informs decisions that are going to impact those who do live in the smart cities. And so I came up with sort of I call them pillars. I don't know that they're really pillars. Maybe features is a better word, of what I think a smart city needs to have to really be considered smart. The first point, and I think considering the quality of the audience, you all certainly have an interest and, if not expertise, in technology. And this is sort of the part that you are studying, is the physical and cyber infrastructure that allows cities to capture data from essentially IoT devices. And IoT devices become the kind of like a connective tissue that is capable of linking the underground, the ground, and the above ground reality of the city. Because let's remember that the smart city is not just what you see, the smart city is also what happens below and above it. And physical infrastructure is where a lot of the literature, especially the technical literature, and I suspect that's where you guys excel, is raising certain concerns. And if I had to summarize, I think the concerns are primarily two. The first one is that obviously big tech has an interest in embedding their own technology in this smart city spaces. And so the very first problem is that of entrenchment. Once, the very first big technology player manages to create the physical infrastructure that the smart city is going to use, it's going to be very difficult for that infrastructure to then be replaced by something completely different. So you've got this problem of entrenchment in a kind of technology. The related sort of, maybe if you wish, a corollary to that particular problem is the fact that once this technology is embedded, there's often concerns and issue of compatibility. And I think, Professor Vermeys, at some point you will be talking about how some technology in the courtroom, which provides incredible advantages for the management of trials, sometimes causes problems because the two pieces of technology simply don't talk to each other. The second concerns that the literature is starting to look with a little bit more of a critical eye is sort of overarching what I think is the first feature of a smart city, and the second one. The second one is this aspirational objective, the ambition of the smart city to optimize resources, making everybody's life easier, achieving environmental objectives, and achieving security objectives, and the inclusivity component. I have read now a good amount of non-law articles and reviews and commentaries that start wondering how empirically correct is the statement that smart cities are actually creating greater sustainability. Because I think the question, or the answer to the question, will vary according to which data point you look at. Technology itself, to be developed and embedded in city, produces a certain carbon footprint. So you can not only consider if you think about it in the context, for instance, of transport, you can not only consider how much CO2 emissions you've reduced since the implementation of smart city technology, you need to consider also how much was emitted for the particular piece of technology to then be embedded in the city. So the physical and cyber infrastructure that allows this kind of network that sits above us and sort of digests the terabytes and above data that we produce on a daily basis is, we're told, collected for the purposes of making our lives better. Strong criticism as to where is the data, where is the evidence that this is what is happening. And the third piece, as I said, the third piece is us, and I sort of rather pretentiously call the third piece is the humans. I use this terminology because I'm thinking about different interpretation of different features of who the humans are. The first group is us, as the citizens of the cities. I already mentioned, we generate the data, but we're also the recipients of the decisions that are allegedly made for effectiveness and sustainability by the smart city. The second group of sort of humans is the government. Generally, smart cities are considered in the context of local government. And that's why sort of at the beginning, I wondered, do you really need it to be a city to be labeled as a smart city? You actually don't. It's sort of a big label to suggest local government. That's where that piece, I think, is very, very important. And then the third big player is obviously is the industry that is capable of providing the technology for local governments, that has certainly in the United States, but I'm sure also across the globe, starting to interact with local governments by a way of public-private agreements or projects, PPPs. Now, these public-private projects have existed historically for a very long time, and have also existed in the context of major infrastructure for national governments. The problem when you have IBM or Cisco or Microsoft or Amazon on one hand and a tiny little government official on the other is that empirical data has proven the terms of these agreements have been greatly in favor of the technology and the business, if you wish, and have disadvantaged, in fact, even not even taken into account the interest that the local government was trying to explain. And we'll get there in a second. I just want to stress something. I'm sure it's obvious once again that the audience in the room is very well aware, but data can be used for different purposes. So this is a picture that Nicholas, our former colleague Lindsay, took when she went to New York City, but she was tasked to try to collect images of sort of smart city technology, and then we spent a bit of time in class saying, okay, where is the smart technology? And the principal piece of technology is actually the smart waste basket or paper basket or whatever we want to call it. So smart trash. The idea is for sensors to be positioned within the bin to detect at what point the bin is about to be full and needs to be emptied, and therefore saving time for the city to go around and empty bins that don't need empty. which makes eminent sense. Again, it's an idea of this great sustainability. In fact, the city is going to be a better city. You're going to have less traffic because they will, city sort of cleaning teams will be deployed when needed. But the kind of data that tells you about sort of what point the bin is going to be full also tells you something else, right? It tells you how many people are in that particular area. And if you have a hostile third party getting hold of this kind of data, then the smartness of the trash might be used for purposes that were not intended to be used. I want to now, because I'm conscious of time and I don't want to blabber on, I'd like to have a little bit of time for Q&A. I want to just spend a few more minutes on what I think is the functional component and how the use of technology is posing challenges that certainly in the legal literature we're just about starting to explore. And so I call these problems the governance risk. And what do I mean by that? I mean that the smart cities initiatives, or smart cities generally, if you want to call it that way, on the one hand, lack the kind of critical analysis: do we really need this technology? Is this technology that we're embedding in our spaces achieving the purposes for which it's being sold to us? The second, which is the bit where I'm more interested in, where I have slightly more competence, is the governance of the res publica, right? These partnership between private sector and public local officials are capable of producing distorted governance results in terms of what the objective is for the data manipulation. And so I try in this picture, you will see Professor Vermeys is phenomenal at illustrating. I am always sort of lagging behind. This is as artistic as I'll ever get. But what I try to capture here is sort of this idea of what the smart city, this perfect, look, everybody's walking, everything is green, you see very few cars and they all look like Teslas. But there's problems. There are significant problems that are sort of embedded in this product that we're being sold. Loss of privacy, and I'm sure that all of you are familiar with this, and so I'm not going to go on it. Privatization of citizens' data. So once this data is collected from public places, so I'm not talking about the data collected from my personal mobile phone, because that too is privatized, but it's not necessarily being used for public purposes. But the data that is, I was talking last week to a professor in Philadelphia who was commenting about how he's being nudged in Philadelphia to swipe a particular card every time he uses public transport, although he doesn't need to. And that card is linked to his credit card, which is linked to his address, is linked to his social security number, is linked to his identity. Is it really necessary to collect this professor's identifiable data to just determine how trafficked or what the traffic flow for public sector, for public transport is going to be? And the answer is obviously no. But this data, once collected, becomes the ownership of big tech. And that's, again, one of those other concerns that have arisen in the literature. I'm going to go very quickly over the other three. The corporatization of public services. So now what are services, for instance, healthcare, which again in the US has been privatized for a really long time. It now becomes an industry, a public sector industry, with all the dysfunctionality that I'm sure you know exist. We as citizens are now reduced into data points. And even the most technologically oriented member of the audience would agree that as a human being, we're a little bit more than just the sum of our data point. And the most severe of concerns is sort of the kind of surveillance capitalism, where our wants, our desires, our objectives get sort of manipulated and shaped by those who collect our data and therefore make decisions for us. So I think, and I'm going to just stop here, that there is actually an accountability gap for this kind of decision making that has an impact on how citizens live. And if you do want, during Q&A, I will be talking about a project in Toronto, the Keysight project, which in my mind was an example of what happens when big tech doesn't necessarily work in harmony with local government, and grassroots organizations get a whiff of what's going to happen and block the project. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing the screen, and I look forward to hearing Professor Vermeys' presentation.
Oh, well, thank you for Professor Giuffrida. And to basically follow up and continue on this train of thought that she illustrated with the smart city, and Professor Giuffrida mentioned that a smart city is basically based on governance. And obviously governance implies laws, and laws imply a way to promote those laws, apply those laws, and therefore the pertinence of talking here about a place where those laws are applied, i.e. A smart courthouse. Of course, do we actually need a smart courthouse? That's a question in itself, and I'll get back to that in a few minutes. But as Professor Giuffrida mentioned, my outline is very similar to hers, and we'll discuss the concept of what a smart courthouse is, looking at courthouse design. And we'll do this very quickly because I want to get through courthouse design and courthouse components in order to very quickly get to the third part, which is the one that I think that most people in the room here will be more interested in. And that is basically, how are we moving towards the use of more technology and online courts and robot judges, to use a sexy expression that, as you may guess, is quite unfounded when you actually look at what it is supposed to suggest. So let's start with courthouse design. And obviously, I already asked a question. And that question is, well, what is a smart courthouse? And following the same train of thought as Professor Giuffrida, we understand that, well, a smart city isn't just simply incorporated technology into the city, just like, well, a smart courthouse isn't just saying, well, we're going to have more signage and computers everywhere in the courthouse to tell people where to go and how to get there and what to do. But we have to really reimagine the structure of the courthouse itself. And that is something that was mentioned by Langdon Winner in his famous book, The Whale in the Reactor. And if you haven't read it, I strongly suggest it, whether you're in computer science or in law, or in fact, in any field that deals with technology. And as Professor Winner mentions, as technologies are being built and put to use, significant alterations in patterns of human activity and human institutions are already taking place. And so it's not just the idea of incorporating technology, it's how do we do it in a smart manner? And just to illustrate that, the picture you have on screen right now is actually a screen grab of an American movie called The Founder. And you're probably wondering, well, what do we see here? And what we see here is actually a McDonald's kitchen. And so in order to ensure that the kitchen was the most efficient possible so that you can get your Big Mac or your fries or your soda as quickly as possible, well, they tried different floor plans in order to figure out exactly what would make it as efficient as possible. And what we're seeing with smart courthouses, and I use quotes here, well, what we're seeing is the same concept. When you're drawing a smart courthouse, you have to take into account all of the technology that's going to be included. And that means, well, you're not just simply going to have now in your courthouse your judge, your clerks, your parties, and their lawyers or legal representatives. You're also going to have, obviously, an AV specialist like we have right now, and that individual is going to have a place to settle. Now, on the right-hand side of your screen, and I actually have a pointer, so you can see here the top picture you have, that's the courtroom in Williamsburg where Professor Giuffrida is right now. It's a courtroom at the University of William and Mary, the most technologically advanced courtroom in the US. And as you can see, you have the judge's bench, and right next to it, you have a station for the audiovisual technician, which is extremely practical because if there's an issue, that means that the judge can consult that individual rapidly. However, that also means that that person is in the front of the room and therefore can become a distraction. So below you have the courtroom, that we have at the University of Montreal, which is the most technologically advanced courtroom in Canada. And you'll understand that there's a nice little competition with myself and Professor Giuffrida and her team to know which of us has the most gadgets in our courtrooms. I like to think that right now I'm ahead, but they received funding not too long ago, so I'm probably going to fall behind soon. But all that to say, our audiovisual technician, as you can see here, is in the back so that they do not interfere with the process, which, again, very practical for that. However, if there's a cable behind the bench that breaks, that means they have to cross the whole courtroom. And so these are things that seem insignificant, but they can impede the whole process of a trial or of a hearing. And you also have to think, well, if I'm going to have a smart courthouse, I'm probably going to have to have a server room. Now, you're probably thinking, well, you don't really need a server room in 2022. You can simply go on the cloud. Try to convince judges of that. So a judge that I will not name because we're recorded and this is currently going on YouTube actually told me that if ever there were going to be servers on which there was data for the courts, those servers were going to be in her office. Notwithstanding the fact that that would be very noisy and warm for her, I'm not sure that's necessarily the best way to secure those servers, but I digress. And then when you're talking about courtroom design on top of that, you also have to discuss, well, the furniture itself. So on the left-hand side of your screen, you have a classic courtroom. And on the right-hand side, well, you have a more modern one where all of the desks are basically combined into one small island. And the reason for that is extremely simple. You have to find a way to pass all of the cables and all of the computer screens. This is a courtroom in Montreal. It's also a death trap, right? If you pass behind that desk and you trip on those wires, you could hurt yourself and that's not even talking about the impact it could have on the process itself. Going further, why are we talking about having a smart courthouse? Well, because, and Professor Giuffrida referred to it, what we're looking at now more and more is more and more data that is digital, right? It's very rare nowadays that the original version of a document is paper-based. Usually they're technology, and you saw in Professor Giuffrida's presentation as well, a lot of cases where data was gathered by the state or by the municipality or by private corporations, and that is usually what's going to wind up being brought into evidence. So if your evidence is now data-based, well, the result obviously is that you're going to have a technologically advanced courtroom. Now, this is the classic components, or these are the classic technological components of a courtroom. And you might say, well, that's not really that advanced, right? These are all technologies that we're used to. But in fact, for courthouses, this is revolutionary because walk into most courthouses in the world right now, and if you see a computer screen already, it's quite impressive. And the issue we have, and again, Professor Giuffrida mentioned that, is that of compatibility. Not only do you have to ensure that all of these tools connect to each other, you have to make sure that all of the software that's being used is compatible, but also you have to make sure that all of this technology is compatible with quote unquote dead technologies. So you're still going to need to have access to a VCR, for example, because evidence from things that happened 5, 10, 15 years ago might still be on a VCR. So we had this famous case in Quebec where there was a trial and one of the parties arrived with a floppy disk in court and said, "The evidence is on here, Your Honor." And the judge looked at him and said, "Great, how do we look at it?" And so they actually had to suspend the hearing and send somebody in the basement of the courthouse to try to find a computer that's as old as I am, so that there would be a floppy disk a reader in it. And so all of this still has to be made available. And then obviously you have to think about how are you going to structure things to incorporate all of this technology without impacting, for example, sightlines. So again, you have here a picture on your right, or two pictures on your right, of our courthouse in Montreal, and look at the difference depending on how the screen is positioned, whether or not you can actually see the person that is testifying. And regarding sightlines, you also have issues now with privacy, or the question of confidentiality or confidential data. So this is a courtroom in the US. Couple of issues here. First of all, it's backlit, so you can actually not see the judge when you're actually pleading, which not, again, a great thing. But, and it's not super clear for those in the room here. Maybe it's a little clearer for those who are watching this online. But here you have the table for the prosecution, and you have their computer screens. And here is where the jury sits. Notice an issue, right? The jury has a perfect line of sight to all of the evidence that the prosecution is preparing. Now, for the defense, Not much better. They're sitting there, their screens are facing the back, and behind them are the court clerks. So all the staff for the judges. So again, not the best way of doing things. So you have to keep all of that in mind as well. And last but not least, and certainly not least, you have to take into account the issue of controlling data flows. Because in court, usually, if you've watched any television court shows, or for those of you who are lawyers or studying law currently, well, you know that the judge controls everything that's going on in the courtroom. And in theory, that's great. In practice, if you're going to have digital information, well, it's a lot more complicated. So you have to control these data flows and try to see exactly how you're going to structure the system inside the courthouse so that the data is controlled by the judge. But this takes for granted something that I referred to at the very beginning, and that is that we need courthouses. And what I mean by that is, well, a courthouse is a building. Do we actually need a building to render justice? We need a place, but does that place have to be a building? And that's something that's up for debate. And in fact, there is great debate around it. And there are those that say, well, no, we don't need a building. There was a famous report out of the UK a few years ago that basically said, we should just take all the courthouses, transform them into condos, and send everything online for justice. After all, you can consult your doctor online, you can do your taxes online, so why couldn't you just go to court online? And while this is true in certain cases, and I would argue that there are many types of disputes that can definitely be resolved online. I'm a big proponent of online dispute resolution. My team and myself have developed over the years a certain number of online dispute resolution platforms. So I'm the last person to claim that it's not a good thing. But it's also, it would also be wrong of me to claim that ODR can solve every issue and that all issues can be settled online. So what can be done online? Well, during the pandemic, we found out there's one thing that can happen, and that is, well, virtual courts or online courts, basically having trials using Zoom or Teams, or the French use Blue Jeans, which I don't know if anybody else in the world uses. I had never actually heard of it before. I work with French colleagues. And then you have Cisco WebEx and so on and so forth. But you have all these online platforms that we've all used for teaching, and we're using it right now for this conference, that during the pandemic and since then were used and are being used by the courts. But of course, these technologies all share one major flaw, the fact that they are not neutral. And this is a quote by Donald Norman, who famously said technology isn't neutral, and he is not the only one and probably not the first to have stated it, but probably the one who has stated it the most succinctly. And the fact that the technology is not neutral is a big problem in this case because, well, you don't want technology to impede the legal process. And I would say there's another issue that falls from that main one, and that is that these technologies were created for, in the case of Teams, for example, well, it's in the name, right? For team meetings, for discussions, for exchanging information. In the case of Zoom, for classes, for conferences, and so on. None of them were developed for the courts. And these pieces of software very often were not developed with the courts in mind, with the legal process in mind. And even those that figured, oh, well, I'll add a few components for the courts, very often they're doing it for the courts as they see them on television. And so they're doing it for Law and Order, for Suits, for those of you who are younger in the audience. And they're not actually doing it for the courts as they actually exist in the world. So a year ago, I was tasked with auditing a tribunal's use of Teams in Quebec, in Canada, I'm sorry. And so we basically asked people that use Teams during a hearing to tell us, to answer a few questions, right? And to tell us, for example, well, did the platform allow me to present my case and tell the members what I wanted to say during my hearing? Members being the judges here, that's how judges are being referred to in that particular tribunal. And so on and so forth, you can read as well as I can. Now, everybody gets stuck on the big number at the bottom, right? A satisfaction rate of 86%. And that would lead us to believe that, well, people think it's actually great to have online platforms or to use online platforms. and to basically have justice in that particular manner. But in fact, we have no idea if that number is high or if that number is low, simply because we actually have zero statistics from prior to the use of technology. So for all I know, this is actually, there's a level of satisfaction that's twice as high as that of people who would be in person, but it could also be the opposite. So we could have 100% for people that are in person versus the 86% here. And so all that to say, yes, definitely these platforms can be useful and were quite useful during the pandemic. But as we move forward, we need to figure out exactly what their impact is. So in that same study, I came up with a series of findings. And again, there are those classic quotes that you'll find online about how the courts handled the use of Zoom, and those fun stories that became memes, such as this doctor who was operating while he was testifying, and the judge said, well, could you at least put down the scalpel as I'm asking you questions? And you have this judge in Brazil that didn't realize that his camera was on, and so he was hearing a case while shirtless. That being said, he was in great shape, so good for him. And last but not least, I'm sure all of you heard about this lawyer who had a cat filter on his face and tried to explain, this was in Texas in the US, and famously said to the judge, Your Honor, I'm ready to proceed. I am not a cat, which good to know. But past those statements or those little stories that are amusing, there are a lot of issues that we need to worry about. Now, as I mentioned, there seems to be a high level of stakeholder satisfaction, but what are we comparing it to? And why are they satisfied? These are questions that we don't have the answers to simply because we started gathering data about online trials and didn't gather data before that. And then I won't go through every one of these elements, but as you can see, elements 5 to 10 all start with fears, and the fact that there are a lot of fears linked to the use of this type of technology. Fears regarding witness tampering, the loss of nonverbal cues, technical issues, security issues, so on and so forth. Now, some of these fears are founded, some of these aren't as legitimate. For example, the fears regarding the loss of nonverbal cues, we lawyers like to pride ourselves in saying, well, we can get to the bottom of things and we can tell whether or not somebody is telling the truth. Actually, every study that's out there that evaluated how good lawyers are at reading nonverbal cues show that we're actually as bad as everybody else at it, and that is very bad. And so, in fact, not being able to read verbal cues might be a good thing, because we might actually be in a better situation to get to the truth. But the last one is particularly important, and that is the open court principle. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with the open court principle, it's the idea that, well, technically, you're supposed to be able to walk into a courthouse and be able to watch a hearing. Why? Because, well, the law is happening and you want to make sure that judges are doing their job properly and they're not being paid while they're sitting at a hearing. And of course, that doesn't happen. But also, well, eventually you might be in trouble with the law. So it might be nice to know what the law is. And so by being in the court, you have access to that information. What we've seen, and especially in the US, is with online trials, a perversion of the open court principle, where people now are watching a trial like they're watching a television show. I don't know if you're familiar with Judge Judy here in Italy. If you're not, lucky you. If you are, it's basically an online trial. And I apologize to the people online who are fans of Judge Judy. I'm sure that she is a lovely person, but it doesn't exactly give us a good idea of how the courts actually function. And what we're seeing now is basically a lot of cases where there would be 5, 10 people in the courtroom watching a trial and trying to understand, or reporters that would then report on it. There are cases in the US where you'll have tens of thousands of people watching a hearing live online on a Saturday morning. That is what impresses me, that on Saturday mornings, there was this particular case where there was 3,500 people on a Saturday morning to listen to just a very ordinary hearing. And so what we're seeing now is, again, all of these issues arise on how the technology is being used. And that is, of course, affecting the process as a whole, but it's also affecting the judges, right? If you're a judge and you know that there are 100,000 people watching you right now, most of you are too young to remember the O.J. Simpson case. But the judge in that particular trial, Justice Alito, was mocked so thoroughly in the media. They actually had on late shows, they would have a troupe of dancers dressed as the judge doing line dancing in the US. And obviously, even though judges are supposed to be beyond that, judges are still human beings. And so all of this will affect you. And so we have to see also how this technology is affecting these judges. And that leads me to the last part of my presentation. And that is, well, maybe because of that, maybe because judges could be swayed by all of this technology, maybe because the technology will have an impact on how they decide, or could have an impact on how they decide, maybe we should move towards robot judges. And that's the argument that a few scholars have made. And this is an article by Daniel Chan, who basically summarizes all of the studies that were made regarding the fact that, well, judges are human beings. And because they're human beings, sometimes they're in a good mood and sometimes they're in a bad mood. And obviously, if they're in a good mood, they're probably going to be a little more lenient on whoever is appearing in front of them. And if they're in a bad mood, well, you can gather what that implies. And so, for example, if a judge argued with their spouse the day before, there's a pretty good chance that they're going to be in a bad mood, and therefore they might be a little less lenient. If their favorite sports team won the day before, then maybe they'll be in a better mood and be a little more lenient. There's actually statistics that say you're better off being heard after lunch than before lunch, because a hungry judge is an angry judge, and so on and so forth. So all of this data goes to tell us that, well, maybe judges aren't as neutral individuals as sometimes we believe they are. And while, again, there is some truth to that, those statistics do exist, I think it's minimizing the role of a judge, and it's also not taking into account a constellation of other factors, most notably how the laws are written. And sometimes judges look like they're biased against individuals when in fact they're just applying a biased law. And well, it's not their job to decide whether the law is right or not. Their job is to apply it. And so some individuals, because of the fact that, again, judges can make mistakes and they can be in a better mood or a worse mood, and therefore you can see it in the case law that it's not always equal, or that there are decisions on similar fact patterns that will gather different results. Well, maybe we should move towards AI systems and the use of AI in order to basically replace these judges. Now, this is a quote from Max Tegmark, as you can see in his book, Life 3.0. And I want to just draw your attention to the first part of the sentence there, which is, since the legal process can be abstractly viewed as a computation, inputting data information about evidence and laws, and outputting a decision, some scholars dream of robot judges. Actually, I would argue with that statement, because the law is a lot more complex than that. Yes, of course, we're inputting information about evidence and laws, and there is going to be an output that is a decision. But we're applying this input to a specific fact pattern, and that fact pattern needs to be taken into account. So a couple of examples of that when people are talking about robot judges and what they can do. So, for example, in Canada, there was this article a few years ago saying, oh, robot judges are coming because there's this professor here in Canada that just programmed an algorithm that can pass the Japanese bar. And the professor in question, Professor Goebel, who's actually a colleague, oops, I'm sorry, I went a little too quickly, who's actually a colleague with another colleague, Professor Sato, they developed, in fact, yes, it's true, this AI that can pass the bar exam in Japan. But that's more of an indictment on how bar exams are written than evidence that, well, if a piece of software can pass the bar exam, then a piece of software can replace a judge. And in fact, everywhere where they have promised robot judges, or they have proposed the idea of robot judges, we can see that, well, there have been similarly issues. So this is an article that came out just a few months ago by two Chinese scholars who talk about this robot judge in China. And I think it's probably the first real robot judge. There have been other trials, but trial and errors. But the only other one that I know of is Justice Alexis from the Kids Court on Alexa, on the Amazon smart system there, where basically you can put your kids in front of your Echo and launch Justice Alexis, which will then settle a dispute between your children if you don't want to take care of that on your own. But in China, they actually took that whole idea one step further, and they had this robot judge truly in the sense that you would imagine it. Of course, it's not an actual robot, and I'm sure I don't have to explain that to anybody in this room. It's just a piece of code, a piece of software. Hence the idea that you don't really need a courtroom. If you're going to have software decide, then you don't really need to be in the same room as it. But what's interesting when you actually read the article is they say, so it works perfectly, except for this one case where this gentleman was accused of murder. And therefore, because he killed somebody, he got a particular sentence, and so was sentenced to jail. But what the software didn't take into account is the person he murdered raped his mother. Now, that tends to color things a little bit, and the people in China were insulted, were appalled that such a decision was rendered. Another example is in the US, a system called Compass. Compass is the, as you can see, correctional offender management profiling for alternative sanctions. And what it is, it's basically a tool that was programmed in order to help those who work in jails or prisons to establish if somebody, when they're going to be released because they're at the end of their term, to see if they are going to be dangerous for society. So what Compass does is, well, you have access to a certain number of data points. You have 137 questions that are asked to detainees. And according to the answers given to those 137 questions, well, people will be given a score. And the score is between 1 and 10, 1 being not very dangerous, 10 being very dangerous. Now, the issue that has arisen in the US with this particular tool with Compass is that it is now being used by the courts to establish how long somebody should go to jail when they've committed a crime. And what they do basically is use this information to say, well, if somebody has a score of 10, well, that means when they get out of jail, they're probably going to commit a second crime anyway, so we might as well send them to jail for longer, which is not how the court system is supposed to work. And the other issue, obviously, and I'm talking mostly to technology specialists here, is that, well, we know exactly how many data points are collected, right? There are 137 questions, but we don't know how many people are actually in that data set. We don't know where the data subjects are coming from, so we don't know how this database was built, and we don't know what weight is attributed to each of these 137 questions. And so that gives rise to a certain number of issues. And then the other problem is when you're making these types of tools available to judges. So if you say, okay, we're not going to go with robot judges because, as I just demonstrated, that might be going a little too far. And there's another issue that I'll get to in a few seconds. So maybe we just want tools like this that will tell judges what their decision should be, but the judge still makes his or her decision on their own. The issue is we as human beings have a tendency to blindly follow what technology tells us. Now, quick question to everybody in the room here. Who here in the last week has verified that their calculator hadn't made a calculation mistake? Right? Nobody. We take for granted that when we're using a calculator, when we're using Excel, that there won't be a math mistake because that's how it's programmed. It's supposed to be right. And so we have that issue with all technology. But one thing that I didn't mention and that I'm going to close on that is extremely important is that in order to build these robot judges or in order to build these platforms that will help us give proper indications to judges as to how they should decide, we need data. And again, I'm not talking to people who are unaware of this. And so if you're talking about training an algorithm in order to tell you, for example, that a cat is a cat, I'm going by statistics that were written by the creator of Siri, a French gentleman, who in his autobiography says, well, in order to recognize that a cat is a cat, you need roughly 100,000 pictures of a cat, according to current machine learning algorithms. Finding 100,000 copies of a particular fact pattern in decisions in law is almost impossible because law is local. And so I cannot use Italian decisions, for example, to train a Quebec algorithm because your decisions are completely useless in the French court because it's not the same law. And we're not even talking about municipal courts now, where obviously municipalities have their own laws as well. And so the lack of data makes it almost impossible to actually be able to build these robot judges, these tools for judges to be able to decide. So what's left? Does that mean that we can't use AI and that AI cannot help us make our cities smarter and therefore courthouses or courtrooms or court processes smarter? Well, that's not the case at all. There are already tools out there, what are referred to as self-guided pathways, or in this case, this is the Solution Explorer in British Columbia, that basically are using artificial intelligence to give legal information to parties so that they are better equipped when they come in front of a judge. And this is another example. This is the Justice Bot, a tool that my team and I are building in Montreal that's basically giving legal information to individuals so that they can be better equipped to face the opposing party when in front of a judge. I probably went over the 20 minutes that was allocated to me, so I do apologize for that. But on that note, I would be happy to take your questions, as I am certain would be Professor Giuffrida. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Nicholas. Thank you so much. Thank you, Iria. I'll never share the information about Alexa because my child will probably settle disputes with me through Alexa. So I don't want to challenge him on that front. Let's see whether we have questions.
Don't be shy. I like
Actually, they aren't. So there's. I can do that. Okay. Yeah, okay. You like, you also wave your hand, right?
One, two, three. So from a technical standpoint, AI is an approximation tool, which works pretty effectively, generally speaking. But law is a practice of preciseness and the exact words. For example, the tool that you just mentioned you were developing uses NLP technology, which generally works well, but using even a single word differently, or even like emphasizing it more or emphasizing it less, can turn over a case and turn over a sentence. And since, as I mentioned earlier, AI is inherently an approximation tool, and that's why it's so useful. How are you planning on solving that, or how will you address that problem?
So that's an excellent point that you're making. And in fact, it's a point that I regularly make to my law students when they're saying, oh, well, we'll use AI and we'll have robot judges and let's just find another field of profession because we're going to be replaced by robots. And the idea is to not make, so these tools in law are called predictive tools. And I hate the expression predictive tools for the exact reason that you just mentioned, right? These tools cannot predict anything. What they can do is give you information. So if you say, for example, so the tool that's there and the example that was there is the person wrote, this is for a housing conflict. So basically, if your homeowner is not treating you right or whatnot. And in this case, the person said, well, I'm cold. And so the platform said, well, you say you're cold. What does that imply? Does that imply that there's no heating in your apartment? Does that imply this? And so by asking these questions to make sure that the platform actually understands what the person is saying, well, you're making sure that there's no confusion. And then the platform doesn't say, well, you said you're cold, therefore you're going to win your case and you have to do this. because again, that would be predictive. And a lot of these tools will give you statistical probability, right? You have a 65% chance of winning your case. To a lawyer, that means absolutely nothing. I don't really care that I have a 65% chance of winning my case. What I want to know is, why do I have a 35% chance I'm going to lose my case? That's what's interesting to me. And so this platform doesn't give you statistics because, to quote a former British Prime Minister, there are 3 types of lies, right? Lies, damn lies, and statistics. And so statistics are useless in this context. What you want is information. So what the platform does is it says, okay, these are the pieces of information that you've given me. And considering this information, these are cases that are similar to yours. Read the case, it'll give you an idea of what the courts decide in these cases. Doesn't mean that the fact pattern is exactly the same as yours, doesn't mean that this is actually going to help you, but these are the types of cases that might be relevant. And that way you don't have to go through 10,000 cases. You can just read the 2 or 3 that the platform found to be interesting in considering the fact pattern that you presented.
Okay, I have a question to Professor Vermeys. So you said in your speech there are some issue with machine learning algorithm where you cannot put weights to every fact of crime. For example, you mentioned this, like, okay, this guy made a crime, he killed someone, but we didn't consider that guy make something bad to his mom, right? So I'm sure there should be some procedure for people who make this crime, like, okay, if this guy makes this crime and if it was somehow relevant, so he had motivation, we should put him for prison, but probably like few years less. So if this procedure exists for people, why you think it's so hard to make this procedure for machine learning algorithm?
Because it's very hard to program common sense. As I was referring to a few minutes ago, you would need to have enough evidence, enough cases and examples for it. So if you haven't thought of a particular case when you program the algorithm, then you're going to have a decision that doesn't take that into account. And so I'll just give you an example. Your civil code here is, I was told today, what, 5 years old? Or you have a new civil code, I believe, and it's, well, relatively new. It's been around just for a couple of years. Did I understand that properly?
It's not civil code. There's several codes, but the civil code dates back during fascism. So you'll probably mention another code.
Okay, so I'll take our civil code. So the Quebec Civil Code, the one that we're using right now was adopted in 1991, came into effect in 1994. So our civil code is roughly 25, 28 years old. A lot of the sections in the civil code have yet to be interpreted by the courts. So we still don't know how they will be interpreted. I cannot train an algorithm on data that doesn't exist yet. So there's just no way for me to program it to learn and to know what to do in the case of in the case where these dispositions come in front of it. A judge, on the other hand, the first time this decision will come in front of him or her, well, they'll use their common sense and they'll try to draw parallels with other areas of the law. Now, technically, the algorithm could try to draw parallels with other areas of the law, but you have to program that. And so you have to guess every possibility of these dispositions, how they're going to be interpreted, how they're going to be used, what arguments the parties are going to make. Because don't forget, the judge is basically listening to 2 different scenarios, that of the defense and that of the prosecution, or if you're in a civil trial, then of both parties. So it's depending on what these 2 individuals present as evidence, and that's also going to impact. So it's not a question that you can't program an algorithm that would take all of that into account. It's that it would be extremely expensive and time consuming because you would have to guess every possible scenario that is just not out there yet.
Considering the importance of lawyers in the court.
Thank you.
How does lawyers fit in the robot judge situation?
Well, basically, again, we're talking hypotheticals. If you look at the Chinese situation, maybe Professor Giuffrida has other examples. The judges are, instead of pleading a case, they're just entering facts and entering evidence into the software. So they're basically now inputting data. And obviously, if you're inputting data, you're not doing the job the same way you used to. Now, again, there are some pluses and some minuses to that. We have in French an expression called un effet toge. There's no real translation for it in English, but it's basically the idea that judges will put on lawyers will put on a show. All right, a toge is the robe that lawyers still wear in certain jurisdictions, and basically, so it's basically twirling your robe would be more or less the translation. Well, you obviously can't do that if you're inputting data. Now, that can be a very persuasive tool if you're dealing with a jury, for example. But if you're dealing with a judge, usually they'll ignore it. But so for lawyers, that means relearning your trade and doing things differently. And it won't surprise you to hear that, well, many lawyers aren't exactly happy at that idea because, well, we're used to doing things a certain way. But I always like to remind judges and lawyers for that matter, or lawyers and judges for that matter, that, well, the legal system wasn't made to give us a job. It was made to give you all access to justice. And so even if we don't like it, if we find a better system, well, we have to take that system.
I have two more.
I think
yes, I have two. Yeah, Iria, do you want to jump in?
Just very briefly, I wanted to link something of these last two very useful questions. And the point is that also the law evolves and lawyers, and Nicholas, I'm actually citing you, lawyers evolve within the span of their career. So decisions on what you in Italy call extra-contractual liability, what we call tort law in common law systems, had literally adapted with the changes in societies. And so there is a risk, not just the challenges that Professor Vermeys has most certainly listed, but there's also risk of entrenching in the administration of justice certain approaches that perhaps over time should change. And I think this particular argument has been made in the US in connection with Compass, the tool that Professor Vermeys has talked about. One of the very many criticisms is that it has probably been trained on a number of criminal decisions are taking place in the United States. And in the United States, there is quite a clear bias against certain underrepresented minorities, which are overrepresented in the criminal justice system. So I think that there's also these other factors that are very difficult to get hold of and sort of try to either prevent or court against.
Thank you. You are first. Yeah.
So my question is, we've been talking a lot about robot judges to enforce the law in the same way that a human judge will enforce the law. But have you ever considered making AI to decide what the law should be, to try and incorporate the fundamental morals of what makes something good and what makes something bad in order to fabricate the law rather than just enforce it?
There is actually a project, and I think it's in the UK. I'm trying to remember who it is now. Professor Giuffrida might remember, where they did just that. They basically tried to train an AI to draft if you were starting a new country and were drafting a new constitution and training an AI to do it. Professor Giuffrida, do you remember where that? I don't remember who does it, but yeah, so that is something that people are looking into. It's an interesting research project. Obviously, the problem is, how do you codify or how do you program values? Because obviously in a society, values are very different from one person to the other and from one community to the other. So you're always going to have these issues. It always comes back to, and a little bit what I was to the question your neighbor asked, how do you basically consider everything when you're programming the AI, and that's what the problem is you have just so much to think of that it's very difficult for somebody like yourselves who are programming these tools to think of everything. And in this case, you really have to think of everything.
And Nicholas, if I can jump in, that's also just to give you a practical example of the illustration of what Professor Vermeys was saying. despite the fact that both Europe and the United States are sort of labeled under the terms Western countries, in Europe, we have a very clear prohibition on capital punishment, which is used not in every state, but it is accepted form of punishment in the United States. Now, I have my value judgment as to whether that is a good or a bad thing. But if I speak with a lawyer trained in the United States who has a great deal of values that we share, we will certainly be at opposing side of that discourse. And although I probably think I am more correct, the other lawyer is going to think the same. So it's very difficult to even distill what those values are, because law is a manifestation of culture. And cultures are very, very different. And I don't know whether you guys have already had the opportunity to even think about different legal systems, such as Sharia law, which is a legal system based on the Quran and on Muslim precepts. And it's a very good legal system that has its values, very different from ours. I'm not sure that we can say that one is necessarily better than the other. And so how can a system come up with the ideal, right? Tool that will fit? I don't think we can get a size-fits-all kind of solution.
And another element that we didn't touch, and this comes back a little bit to what Professor Giuffrida was mentioning as an answer to the previous question, values evolve. And so if I'm training my algorithm, for example, if I were training an algorithm either to decide what the law should be based on values, or to decide what, in a particular case, what the outcome should be based on those values. If that AI had been used 100 years ago, well, right now, there would be no women in this room because, well, back then you were not necessarily, of course, I'm talking I'm not sure for Italy, but I can tell you in Canada or in the US, 100 years ago, there was no such thing as a female law student. Mind you, you're not law students, but you get what I mean. So as the values evolve, as society evolves, well, the laws have to evolve, and therefore the decisions will evolve. That's not possible if you build an algorithm that's only based on what happened beforehand, if you're only programming it on existing data sets, i.e. existing laws and existing case law.
So what about the industrial property of this technology and some permissions or protection that there is, I think, about it?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand your
What
question.
about the industrial property?
Industrial property.
Yeah, of this technology.
Iria, that one's for you.
There is a huge discourse in this moment in the intellectual property literature as to not only who owns the output of these decisions, and in the context of smart cities, this is really being debated, but also who owns the input, who owns the data of how many times I cross the road, how many times I leave the house. In the Toronto project, which I didn't talk about, Side Lab, which is a sister company of Google, so it's a subsidiary of Alphabet, had planned to redevelop a particular area of Toronto, which really was dilapidated, so it really needed investment, and create this ideal policy, this ideal sort of smart, it wasn't a smart city, it would have been a smart area within a city, where all data points would have been collected. And the reason why, I mean, there's different reasons, but the core reason why everything fell out is because Side Lab wanted to own the data points that were being captured. So if there's questions about who owns the input, there's certainly questions about who owns the output. In the context of, for instance, patent law, there is a huge discussion about whether AIs can actually be labeled as inventors of inventions that they have come up with. And there's other discussions about in intellectual property in patents, one of the values that have to be present for a patent to be granted is novelty. But what does novelty mean in the context of having an AI system that can potentially anticipate all sorts of potential outcomes? So there's a lot of discussion about both the ownership of the data that goes in, the ownership of the algorithms, because a bunch of these algorithms, you'll know this significantly better than I do, are actually based on open source data. And then ownership of the output of that process. And Professor Vermeys, you do a lot of work in intellectual property.
I'll simply add, yeah, you have, when you're talking about intellectual property, you're talking about intellectual property on the algorithm itself. You're talking about intellectual property on what the algorithm is producing. And you're also talking about intellectual property on whatever is being used to train the algorithm. And all three of those elements are creating huge issues right now as to, well, who actually owns this? And a great example, there was a portrait, well, you might have read it actually, it was in a lot of papers. So there's this new tool that you might have used, a DALL-E, that you can basically write in DALL-E, I want a mermaid riding a horse in a field covered with snow, and then DALL-E will generate an image for you. Well, so when the image is generated, who owns that new image? Is it yourself or is it DALL-E? You gave it the information, but DALL-E created the image. And well, DALL-E is AI, and AI can't own an image because intellectual property law states that you have to be a human being to own a piece of art that has been created. But then on top of that, a lot of artists have now noticed that their paintings were used to train DALL-E. So now they're wanting to sue because they're saying, well, no, you're using my painting. That's not right. So what was created by DALL-E is actually half created by me because it was directly inspired or using data from the painting that I created. So that's just one example, and I could give you 20 more. I teach a 3-hour class on this, but that's just to give you an idea of how complex the situation is.
And Nicholas, just to follow up to this very example that you have just talked about, very recently a case was lodged. I think it's in New York, where the photographer who took a portrait of the singer Prince in sort of the early days of his career, whose picture was then used by oh gosh, the name is, I'm having a moment of senility. Nicholas, can you help me out?
DALL-E or not?
No. It was, is it again?
Wasn't DALL-E? It was
Andy Warhol, sorry. As you know, you're all young in the group, and then middle age will hit you, and this is what happens.
Oh, okay, you're talking about the artist. Sorry, I thought you were talking about the AI. Yeah.
So photographer is now suing the Warhol Foundation because she's saying that the particular piece of art was produced in breach of a license that she'd given to a magazine. So this is happening outside of the AI space. Now you put it into the AI world and you get the same kind of results on steroids.
Thank you for both. So there are a few more questions. I think we'll gather all questions and then ask for a final round of speakers before we hit the 6 o'clock exodus. Okay.
So my question is about the fact that the first real robot judge was implemented precisely in China. So my question is this fact connected with the fact that, let's say, rule of law is not so strong in China?
I would argue that the rule of law is very strong in China. We might not agree with the rule of law in China, but no, actually, it's quite the other way. Because the laws in China are so strict and limited, it's a lot easier to program, I would say. And it's also the fact that, and we didn't get into that, but that China already has their whole I forget what the citizen points,
social scoring.
Thank you. They have their whole social scoring system in certain cities in China where basically you're being filmed, and if you cross the street somewhere when you're not supposed to cross the street, which I notice you never do here. But in China, if you did that in China, you actually lose points. So you have this score, and at the end of the year, if let's say your score is on 100, if you're down to 20, well, 20 means you're not allowed to travel outside of China anymore. You're not allowed to, have access to certain to go see movies, for example, and basically you're punished if you're not a good citizen. And so by having laws that are so strict and have this scoring system, it actually makes it easier to program. And that's getting back to what some of you were mentioning. If you have more data and that it's basically better framed, then it's a lot easier to program. But even then, you see that there are issues.
But there's an under point in the question that you asked, and which is Western countries are taking their sweet time to think about regulation of this kind of technologies for very good reasons. And one is sort of innovation has brought a lot of wealth. The EU has started regulating data, which is now exporting this idea of regulating technology abroad. But there's a group of commentators that make the point that you're making, which is that because Western countries have sort of been hesitant in regulating this development of this technology, countries that have been bolder, of which China is the leader, may be a few years ahead and may actually develop what the idea of smart city is, which then gets to be imposed in systems that are very different. So I think that there is a genuine concern that our delay in thinking constructively and regulating how you train it, etc. So how you use this technology might have given countries that are less keen on, less worried about creating restrictions, developing their system that we're going to then import.
Hello. My question is related to the smart cities. I heard about the problem of the ownership of the data. The example in Toronto, is it like an isolated example, or there are other practices that can regulate this issue? Because to me, it seems like the data is an asset to the public and the public should be enabled to use it. Thank you.
Fantastic question. So the short answer is that the Toronto comes up as being probably the best example of failure to address the issue of ownership of data. And within the concept of ownership, there's actually the problem of anonymization of data. What Anne Cavoukian was actually a former commissioner, information commissioner of Canada, and she was involved it was in a board sort of involved in the project. What she wanted was for all those data points to be anonymized at source. And Side Labs fought that. So this is currently the best example of what happens sort of when things go wrong. Unfortunately, then I can give you a whole list of examples when the tech company managed to embed its technology and managed to sort of enter into an agreement of whatever data was being generated became their data. So there's a lot of work that we need to do as lawyers, but you technologists need to help us out as well in trying to explain to decision makers that the ownership of data, the way in which data is corralled, analyzed, processed, has implications. Unfortunately, as Professor Vermeys was saying, politicians have a sort of a very unhealthy understanding of data as if data were neutral, and it isn't.
I have a question related to the application of AI tools in trials. You mentioned about how we can see some characteristic on judges' behavior when it's about making the sentence, no? Mm-hmm. But what about using AI tools to audit the judges' decisions, no? Because in a way to fight against corruption, no?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the last part of your question?
Yes. What about using AI tools to audit the judges?
To audit judges, to evaluate the judges.
Evaluate, exactly.
So that's actually an excellent question. So in fact, it's something that's happening regularly in the US. In the US, you have two major companies, LexisNexis and Thomson Reuters, that has a tool called Westlaw. And both Westlaw and LexisNexis use AI to evaluate and predict judges' behaviors. So those platforms can actually be used to see that, okay, judge so-and-so, this type of argument will never work against her because she doesn't accept it, or never go in front of her in the morning because she always decides for the plaintiff in the morning, or statistically at least, and so on and so forth. So in the US, there are actually tools that allow you to do that. And one of the reasons is because they have access to all the data, and so they can evaluate. In France, it's actually criminal to develop tools like that. So they actually adopted a law in France, or at least a section of a law that basically says any type of tool that is used to evaluate a judge's behavior is a criminal offense, and you can go to jail for, I think it's up to 5 years, but I'm really not certain. It's five years, yeah. So just to give you an example of how it can be done. So yes, those tools do exist and they are being used in certain jurisdictions where it's legal.
So I'll take a privilege of one quick question to Iria. Just 1 second. So the question will be whether the shortage of energy and the skyrocketing energy costs are pushing people and institutions to reconsider smart cities, or because I take that they take a lot of energy. They're energy eaters. So I'm sorry, it's just a quick question.
Yes, I mean, and I think embedding the question is sort of what I think we share as the potential answer. There's inevitably going to be a reconsideration of the true impact of the smart city. So the branch of the literature that is saying, where is the data that proves that these smart city solutions are environmentally friendly? This group is going to now finally have an opportunity to make this kind of critical analysis. And there will be certainly certain smart city solutions that do improve the quality of life. But I do think that there's a whole other host of smart city solutions that are a money dump. And the money is taxpayers' money. This is our money.
Good. And let me reassure you that we are looking at you, not just the other way while you're talking, because here we are just a camera. So I think that there's one question, just bullet point, if you don't mind. Okay, please.
But you can.
No, I'm going to end up. Okay. So you need.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, like, do you think like we'll end up needing less lawyers in the future?
Thank you for the answer.
I agree.
No,
I concur.
Lawyers are going to be, our jobs are going to be completely different than it is right now. We might go to court less. We might be acting as mediators or arbitrators more. So I think the legal profession will have to reinvent itself, just like architects are no longer drawing plans on paper. They're now using computers, just like every other profession has evolved using technology. Lawyers are going to have to do the same. But I don't think that means that we're going to have less lawyers. I think that just means we're going to have different lawyers.
You want to have a question? Sure, please.
Okay. How about the hacking of the AI? For example, if you put a sentence, for example, cut table pen, but in other way, pen cut table is the same output or has another output? If maybe has another output, is it a hack or what?
Can I tackle that? You're talking about, there's an interesting law review article, if you want, and I'm happy to share it, which sort of in essence says, is using a known feature of a solution, AI solution, whatever that may be, of a security threat and therefore a form of hacking? And the example that they were using was tricking certain sensors and features of Teslas, tricking Teslas in thinking that the traffic light was green rather than being red. So is that a form of hacking? Now, the law has a specific definition of what hacking is. And so that may not necessarily apply in this context, but you're raising the beginning of an entire different seminar that we'll have hopefully another time, which is how technology becomes in itself a national security concern. So we're moving from just electricity and how much electricity can I have in transport, etc., into am I being targeted by a hostile foreign or sovereign state?
Okay, do you want to add anything? Okay.
I could, but it'll take 5 hours. So.
Okay, sure. So thanks for sparing us 5 more hours. I think that these two professors thoroughly deserve a round of applause of ours. Thank you so much for giving also a number of questions. You can imagine how fruitful and helpful this all was. Thank you so much for being with us virtually or physically, and next time we hope to have you physically as well, Iria, and thank you all, and have a good night, everyone. Bye.